afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third technical session of the National Virtual Conference on Economic Dimensions in Judicial Decisions. I'm Srijit SG, Executive Dean of Jindal Global Law School. This session is themed Law and Economics Approach to Competition Policy, Digital Economy, and New Technologies. The distinguished panel for the session comprises of Mr. Manas Kumar Chaudhary, partner Khaitan and Company, Ms. N.S. Napinai, Supreme Court of India and founder Cybersathi, Ms. Sakhi Shah, Senior Research Associate, CUTS International, Mr. Rahul Sharma, founder, The Perspective. And the moderator for the session is Professor Aviroop Bose, my colleague, Professor of Law at Jindal Global Law School. Over to you, Aviroop.
Thank you, Srijit, so much. I want to add my own welcome to Professor Srijit, and I want to, of course, begin by hoping that all of you, wherever you are safe and in the best of your health. Just to, I think I kind of begin with Manas. I have the distinct sort of pleasure of actually working with Manas very closely for a very long period of time. Manas, as the topic suggests, the role of economics in judicial decision making. You have been not only a person who has been worked with CCI, the Competition Commission of India. You have been practicing before the CCI as well as the appellate courts for the last decade. In my experience, when I was sort of an expert with the CCI almost 7 to 8 years ago, it was a very tough uphill task to bring economics into the mainstream of decision making. Payal, myself, Geeta Gauri ma'am, we tried a bit, but there was some resistance. Over the years, in your experience, has that changed? How would you now look at CCI as a decision-making body? How much more economic approach does it adopt in its regular behavioral as well as merger control decisions?
Thank you, Aviroop. Thank you, Srijit and Jindal Global School and CUTS for giving me this opportunity. This is very close and dear to my heart, this competition law. I bumped into this practice by accident, but over the years, I have now become fascinated about this because you tend to know the inside of an industry. And when I say inside of an industry, I mean, you know the conduct of the decision makers within an industry. That's what the Competition Act is interested in. They are not interested in a contract. They're not interested in an agreement which talks about contract law. They're interested in knowing the intent of the agreement. So that is the very interesting facet of Competition Act. The moment I talk about conduct, obviously there would be, as a practicing lawyer, I would like to see that my client is able to defend an allegation. How does one defend? The Competition Act itself provides a plethora of statutory principles in the law, which actually are safe harbors according to the advanced jurisdictions of European Union and the US. The question which Aviroop you have asked is very specific, whether or not the CCI is able to adopt those principles which are already inbuilt in the Act. I would be making a very candid submission that sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. It all depends upon a perception in the market. For example, when any authority dealing with, say, cement, tire, glass, sugar, they tend to believe that they're always in a cartel. They just cannot survive without a cartel. So these perceptions at times, also unnecessarily make inroads into the minds of the people who are making the decisions. They should be objectively understanding a particular issue. Say, for example, in one of the tire matters in the first initial rounds of the CCI, they did adopt a wonderful economic principle that the tire industry being an oligopoly, when I say oligopoly means few players in the market, and it is not that the few players by conduct are not allowing new entrants into the market, but the new entrants are not interested to enter the market because of the initial sunk cost. So the oligopoly continues to thrive on the oligopoly. So what happened in that tire cartel case, during the course of the investigation, the CCI found that the market share amongst the oligopoly was dwindling. It was not stable. So once the market share found to be not stable, CCI concluded that the parties were able to lower their prices, thereby gaining market share. And that's a typical economic principle. If a cartel is stable in terms of market share, it is presumed that the prices are perhaps moving in tandem. On the contrary, in one of the steel matters in the CCI's cartel case, because applying economic tools in cartel investigation is very difficult and very rare, but they did apply. What happened was, out of the 4 oligopolies who are involved in that allegation of cartelization in the price of steel plate and steel rods, CCI found one of the oligopoly member who was actually buying iron ore, and all other 3 were having their captive iron ore mines. CCI concluded that if the 4th player is able to find the market price through signals by market intelligence, that would not be a cartel because it wants to survive in the market, despite the fact its notional profit would be lower than the other competitors who have got the captive iron ore mines. So CCI had given a very fantastic ratio, saying that interdependence amongst competitors at times throwing up parallel pricing may not be a cartel. So this is a typical economic policy which CCI adopted. As late as 2020, when this COVID problem had struck India, CCI was actually disposing of 2 matters relating to cartel. One arose out of a leniency application and other was a non-leniency application. In both the cases, CCI concluded cartel, but did not impose any penalty, giving the reason that since the economy of the industry is going downhills, it would add miseries to them if we impose penalty. And they applied the market condition and did not impose penalty. So these are some of the issues in case of, say, antitrust issues, where CCI at times had applied economic tools, but many a times they did not apply. But in merger control, Abhirup, they do apply more often than not only economic principles. Even in Form 2, they tend to give the HHI. Sometimes they also talk about, say, for example, hypothetical monopolies test. They talk about many issues, which I think is a typical microeconomics. I stop here because I have consumed my 2 to 3 minutes time.
Thank you, Manas. I completely agree with your assessment of how the CCI is a kind of ad hoc movement along with the use of economics. There has been some decisions of the CCI which has been very, for a lack of a better word, in my analysis, very regressive in terms of a lack of an economic approach. On the other hand, there has been, a kind of a consistent movement, especially by some members, often through dissenting opinions even, that a more economic approach should be required. Sakhi, if I could come to you, Manas has, given examples, good examples, but he has he has spoken about the cartel, a few of those cartel cases. As a scholar, as a researcher with CUTS, one of the leading sort of think tanks in this area, what is your opinion about the digital economy and the cases related to the digital economy, the new economy sectors? Do you see there being a trajectory of the CCI and having a more economic approach there, given the fact that many of the cases coming from platform markets, coming from network markets, requires a more robust economic understanding by the regulator?
Right. Thank you, Professor Bose. And I think before I get on to answering the questions, I would just like to say that I'm delighted to be here amongst the panel, and it's a pleasure to be speaking and discussing this with all of you. So thank you. Onto the question, I think Professor Bose, the entire concept of the digital economy, the entire concept of platform markets, zero price markets, the new kinds of economies, the new kinds of markets which are coming up, they in themselves are very complicated than we, I think, tend to understand or realize, given that there are multifacets to these economies, which is not only restricted to, let's understand, competition law, but there are various other aspects which do come into play. In that regard, I think I don't think there has sort of been a trajectory, so to speak, since that's how you asked me. I don't think there's a trajectory in the way that CCI has given its decisions, especially not lately. But however, there has been a lack of proper understanding of how these markets function when we talk about how the CCI has given these decisions. So when you start from the very, very beginning to the very latest things, you see that there has been a development in how CCI understands these markets and how these markets function. When CCI acknowledges the importance of data, when CCI conducts market studies in e-commerce or telecom, or comes out with a paper on blockchain and its effects on competition, or how these both how there's an intersection, you see that there is a nuanced understanding, an understanding which is still developing. But it's just that it's an understanding which is still developing. I think we are very recently starting to see that the CCI is actually starting to take into consideration that these markets function differently. One of probably the best examples right now is the WhatsApp privacy policy case that's currently going on. But at the same time, you just go slightly back and you see that when there was a case in front of the CCI for WhatsApp and WhatsApp Pay, CCI took a step back and said that the introduction of WhatsApp Pay is not going to really hinder competition in the market. So you keep seeing these back and forths in, I think the word that you used was more appropriate than, and more best suited to what I'm trying to say, is that their approach has been more ad hoc. And I think the problem with this ad hoc approach is that it isn't necessarily providing India the country the landscape that we are building into, the framework that we need to boost these digital markets and these digital platforms. Because what essentially happens when CCI takes a step back in deciding or saying that WhatsApp Pay is going to hinder competition in the market is essentially that you fail to understand that it's two different markets where it's the same company taking control. So I think I was just very quickly, I think I will, maybe I've overdone my time, but I will just conclude by saying I was just reading this article sometime back where it stated that all of these companies, they have started at one point, right? Facebook started with social, Google started with search, Amazon started with e-commerce. But now these companies are no longer in those particular sectors. They have gotten down. So the iceberg below the ocean is much, much huge than what we can actually see. So I think the approach of the CCI has been ad hoc, and I think there's a lot more that can happen, which will only come once the understanding of markets is more nuanced.
Thank you, Sakhi. I completely agree with what you kind of said, because I do see that CCI is trying harder, that's for sure. The recent amount of market surveys that they have done indicates a willingness to listen to the industry, as Manas was pointing out in his initial comments. Both CUTS and OP Jindal Global University are affiliated with the CCI as think tanks who work on competition assessments of regulation. So that's another area which CCI is looking forward and has actually kind of been more active in the past. Ms. Napinai, it's a wonderful time to speak with you. As Sakhi said, we have a new a report that CCI has come up on blockchain and competition issues, which is kind of course, completely, up your alley. And if you could kind of tell us, what do you think about CCI's move? Do you have concerns with that report? How you think blockchain and artificial intelligence and, generally speaking, that area of technology future works up with the current report that has come up from the CCI?
Thank you, Aviru. I have a few pointers or points that I would like to raise first before I come to your question. I'm going to start with the last first. I don't know about whether you agree with Sakhi or not. I completely disagree. Pardon me for a contrarian view, but then as a practitioner, I can tell you that to label something as ad hoc merely because two different stances have maybe taken is actually misleading. I felt that point has not come out clearly, so I'd like to start off with clarifying on that. Whenever we speak about adversarial litigation, everything is contingent ultimately on facts. The law is the underlying foundation, but the facts decide which is the course that underlying foundation takes. To merely say that a decision was taken in a particular way in the WhatsApp Pay case as opposed to the Facebook and WhatsApp privacy issue is like trying to compare apples with oranges. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean that a court or a tribunal is deciding something in ad hoc fashion. It is deciding on the basis of the facts before it, applying the law before it. So to say that it's ad hoc or it's just trying to find its way is incorrect. On the latter aspect of what I just mentioned in terms of trying to find its way, competition laws are still at a very nascent stage in India, but it is not new. It's neither new in terms of deciding antitrust, nor is it new in terms of deciding disputes in the digital domain. When we speak about Facebook or WhatsApp, it's a lot more public, and therefore you have heard of it. I wrote my book in, somewhere between end of 2015 to through 2016. I completed the script by about October or so. Some of the most interesting cases for the digital domain came from the Competition Commission. One of the most interesting, and in a way, this trajectory kind of like reflects my trajectory in terms of IPR to cyber laws. And that's how I moved to cyber laws. I used to handle a lot of IPR cases, and including software licensing. And software licensing took me from IPR to cyber laws, actually. Similarly, one of the most intriguing cases to come out of the Delhi High Court was with respect to the Spectrum case, okay? And about FRAND licenses, and it invariably went in favor of Ericsson and the Spectrum cases. And a contrarian view there again was taken by Micromax when it took the case before the Competition Commission to decide on antitrust aspect as opposed to the licensing issues itself. And one of the earliest decisions from the Competition Commission, which was then affirmed by the Delhi High Court, a real pleasure in terms of reading even the Delhi High Court judgment for any student of law. I can tell you, Vibhu Shankar's, if I'm not mistaken, Justice Vibhu Shankar's, is on the issue of when can something amount to an enterprise. So the same issue which was taken up as an IPR issue evolved as a competition law issue. And this is, I'm talking about more than 5 years back, when the Competition Commission in India took up this issue. So the point I'm trying to make, and especially for students who are very interested in this field, is digital law and or cyber laws, technology laws, call it what you will, and competition laws are not alien to each other. A lot of development happened, evolution of technology laws happened in the antitrust field. So this is a fabulous evolving field for youngsters, especially if they want to take it up. Particularly in the US, if you see, antitrust is a field which people specifically focus on. And it's something that's the future, and we need to have specialists in this field. And now moving very quickly to your question, any change, any development is always welcome. Blockchain is something which has been struggling because of its association with cryptocurrency and this natural disinclination then when we talk about policies to de-link cryptocurrencies from blockchain. So when we are talking about blockchain and competition laws, and as you rightly said, why only blockchain? I just spoke to you about Spectrum. We are already seeing about privacy policy. So you have data protection also coming into the picture. And data protection and artificial intelligence, again, cannot be spoken about, in isolation. They always go hand in hand. And then you now have blockchain coming in to kind of create a validation process. All of it taken together is something that we should welcome as we are only in an exploratory stage now. It's too early to start critiquing something, Sometimes I feel when we start critiquing, we tend to miss the forest for the trees, right? we go into too many nitty-gritties, which may be problems with the policy statement, but the policy statement itself may not necessarily be wrong. So we need to now look at the broader picture and see where we can take this flow. Like I told you, law finds its path based on the foundational aspects that have been laid down. First principles still apply, and we have to wait and see how the competition laws are going to be applied further to technology disputes, and every single thing, whichever way the scale drops, is actually a progressional process and not really regressive, according to me. So these are exciting times, and we should actually be looking forward to progress now on this.
Thank you, Ms. Napinai. Before I go to Rahul, of course, Sakhi, when I'm presuming when you will be able to explain I'll come to you and give you an opportunity to kind of explain your background. Just before I go to Rahul, I kind of also use the word ad hoc, so I will very quickly add what perspective from the digital market I was saying. You're absolutely correct, Ms. Napinai, and I think Manas would agree with you, because I could see him also kind of nodding along that I was not suggesting at all that the outcome of the case, if it varies from one case to the other, there has to be kind of a difference in terms of sort of the way it has been appreciated. That's of course not the point of view. Actually, I wrote a paper with Professor Shah of NIPFP, who is also currently a research professor, Ajay Shah, and we worked on network markets. That entire paper was on network markets. What we found was the way, for example, relevant market was defined in some of the e-commerce cases, the way some of the AEC assessments happened. Again, you could reach a conclusion, but we found that it was not always the same standards. There was kind of appreciation of evidence differed. What form of evidence they looked into itself differed. Again, the Uber and the Ola cases, there's a couple of them now. But of course, you're absolutely correct. Just because the CCI reaches a conclusion which kind of is one-sided or the other, you should not conclude that they are ad hoc. I'm completely with you. And I will come back and we'll have a little bit longer discussion on that. Rahul, I know you yourself, you're a privacy expert, you are an advisor, sort of, and through the perspective, you do a lot of advisory work in this area. Again, it's a very interesting moment, as Ms. Napinai was suggesting. It's an area which has come into the play of CCI with the recent, you can say, some people will say usurpation, somebody will say appropriation of privacy into antitrust. I know I have friends in America or the US scholars who WhatsApp me aghast with such developments. Being an antitrust puritist, that Puritarian, that we shouldn't touch privacy. What is your view generally from not only from a competition point of view? That's also a question that I have. But what do you think is happening with the concept of privacy and data, given that we still don't have a regulator in India, and you see an all-economy regulator trying to provide some guidance in this area? What is your view?
Right. Thank you, Avirup, and thank you, Jindal Global Law School and Kutch for inviting me. And hope everyone is doing safe in these tough times. And condolences and belief to the people who are not doing well, whose families and friends are suffering. So coming back to this topic, the main theme. I think what. So like my background is I am not a lawyer, I am not an economist, but as an observer who has interest in the subject of technology, policy, the evolving ecosystem of regulations and how these intersect to make our lives changed. And this is happening at a very rapid pace. So what we see that in this, if you look at just the last decade or 2 decades, the paradigm shift in terms of what technology, what data-enabled innovation is bringing to us, I think that's huge. And as Napinai said, that change is something that sometimes it looks to us that, are we going in the right direction? But, change, we need to embrace it and find what good can be derived from it, while, keeping the main objectives of stopping the harm. And, that's what the focus seems to be of the regulatory authorities, the governments, the policymakers, and, that's why we are where we are. There is an increasing risks, and, risks are always increasing if we do not give them important consideration in our decision making. And hence this particular theme of the conference is very important on how the role of judiciary becomes very important, because at the end of the day, these are new emerging subjects. Nobody can say they understand them comprehensively. We are all just trying to learn, and especially when a judiciary, when some cases appear before them, they are put in the spot. So like they have a tough task they're constrained to take decisions, because status quo also means handing over a victory to someone or the other. So, and in that process, what they're doing is they are sort of benchmarking certain principles, keeping in mind certain examples. As Napina and you were discussing, there are nuances for every case based on the facts and evidence presented. But now, based on the legal framework, what we have said, and the judicial pronouncements, they sort of lay down, a basic framework or a benchmark that that needs to be followed or observed. That's a jurisprudence. That is the bare minimum that needs to be done. And given that this space, is very very dynamic, and there are no fixed markets. Everything is like morphing continuously, given the the innovation, the adding on of services, the interoperability of things and how things work. So it's something that good to have a greater understanding and sort of try and develop principles so that when the matters land up with courts, so their task should be to make it apply and give a simple, fair, uniform, stable, and guidance in a way that that is also understood by non-legal experts, to say that that we have a common understanding of how things are. And in this particular dimension, so the important task before courts is how do you factor in the economic considerations, the business side of it, the labor, the market side, and also the welfare side, and what priority should it have in terms of the legal and administrative principles which are already laid down in the decision making for the courts. I think that's going to be very important, because as we were discussing, when the discussion started and this point came up, and this example just struck me on the economic consideration for decision making by the courts. And but the biggest example that I can quote is of the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal in the European Union. When it broke out, the US, the South Korean regulators, and a few other countries, they imposed heavy fines on Volkswagen Group immediately, but Europe did not. And the primary reason for that is, one is the government's money was invested in the Volkswagen Group as one of its counties. Plus, if they had also imposed penalties at that time, the company would have gone bankrupt, and it would have led to loss of jobs, destroying of markets and all. So courts do have these considerations when they take or do not take any decisions. So we may try to see on how they are isolated, but I think in some cases they are being given considerations, especially in cases of well-established markets where the fear of changing is tremendous. But since this technology and the data space is something which is relatively new, so in that context, how do you translate the basic principles into something that makes meaningful sense? That becomes very important. And I'll just take a minute more to sort of talk about the primary or the base argument for having a regulator having a look at this space is one is to prevent the lock-in that there's no monopolization. There is the network effects are curtailed, and in this the role of platforms as well as in specific sectors, role of companies has to be carefully adhered to in terms of concentration of power, so that there is a level playing field for everyone. And one important point that Mr. Chaudhary mentioned in his important remarks was on perception, and I would say that in addition to perception, I would also add sentiments, because that is what drives the economic processes more often than not. And there is, sorry to say, there seems to be a lack of trust amongst stakeholders. So yesterday, interestingly, there was this interview that Mr. Pramod Bhasin, who is the father of the BPO industry and Genpact, founder of Genpact, and also is the director general for ICREER now. So he used a very interesting phrase that the judicial pronouncements when it comes to private sector where the cases are involved. So their decisions are, to quote and unquote, crouched in phrases which suggest enormous distrust. And if businesses have those sentiments, if investors have those sentiments that the lack of trust is leading to certain perception, and that perception is leading to certain sentiments, and that is driving that's a cyclical process. So the basic understanding is to sort of bridge the trust deficits and gaps, and I think, given this space is rapidly evolving, I think there is a space for more, coordinated and comprehensive approach on how we approach this subject. Because once we sense the benchmark, and we are just in the initial stages of building digital blocks, and they will be the baseline for the future. So yeah, I think it's more required that we spend more time, more discussions, more dialogue, and come to good principles and evolved frameworks that can be applied. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rahul. If I could turn to both now the two advocates on our panel, Manas and Ms. Napinai. You both of you in your regular course of work regularly approach before courts. And one of the things which Ms. Napinai suggested in her initial remarks was the fact that in the United States, antitrust is not only a legal discipline, it's an equally economics discipline, where you have firms which specialize in the economic analysis of antitrust law and issues, and those are routinely submitted along with the legal sort of files before courts for their appreciation. So if I could turn first to Manas and then to Ms. Napinai, when you go and appear before Indian whether it is the NCLT or whether it is the Supreme Court or High Court, apart from a few judges there who are known to be extremely I do not want to name certain people here, but there are certain judges of the Delhi High Court whom everybody knows they're fantastic in appreciation of economics and on issues of cyber law or of a particular area of technical aspect of competition law. But what is your experience generally speaking? That how much do they allow you space to argue from a law and economics point of view? Are they open to discussions? Do they want to learn along with you, or do you find that it depends upon the bench completely?
So, Abhinav, thank you for that question. It's very interesting. It's mix of the two, because end of the day, every lawyer would believe that there is an element of subjectivity with a judge. Howsoever one may try to be Kelson's pure school of law, the element of the social upbringing a person has, that also gets reflected sometimes in their arguments. I will give certain examples that will, I think, clarify your position. First of all, I should start with saying that what is the aim of Competition Act globally? It tries to discipline the market which arise out of independent agreements between independent enterprises. Now, when I say independent agreements means businesses only run on agreements. Agreements under competition law is primarily horizontal, means competitors. So for example, pro-competitive competitors agreement can be a joint venture, can be a merger control, but it may not be an agreement between two parties trying to fix prices or allocate markets, which would be considered as most pernicious agreement under competition law. Similarly, if you have got an agreement which is vertical and where the person is able to dominate the wheel of the downstream market and is able to operate independently for a longer period of time, despite it is an agreement, it still smacks with the element of unilateralism by the person who is holding the market to ransom. So it is the conduct of the enterprise is more important in a competition law. The moment I say conduct, I am again going back to my old submission that it is nothing but economics. I am doing business for profit. I am not an NGO. I am not an old Section 25 or Section 8 company of the New Companies Act. My job is to earn profit. Competition legislation in India does not really control profit as any other sector regulator does on tariff. So Competition Commission is not bothered about whether you are making unlawful profits primarily, unless you are dominant and you are imposing some kinds of unfair condition on your downstream players and making exploitative profits. It may come within the ambit of profiteering, but mostly the Competition Commission is not mandated to look into the area of profit making by an enterprise. Having said that, having understood as to the conduct is primary, the judges vary. For example, I'll give you a live case of mine. Pharmaceutical companies typically in India mostly are branded generic. They face a very difficult proposition before the CCI that the distributors who are a downstream player, they are actually having a conduct which prohibits a new entrant into the distributors market in the downstream. They do not allow any new distributor to enter the market unless the new entrant pays a hefty sum of money, which is all handled by the distributor association in a manner which is not taxable. So they do not show that money received from a new distributor as income. In the process, what has happened, initially there was altercations between a new distributor trying to enter the market and old distributor association who are incumbent. They then start roping in the pharmaceutical companies, these distributors who are hugely popular and powerful people in the downstream market. They can just issue a boycott notice to a pharma company and the entire chain gets blocked. So the pharma companies were tacitly given a direction that unless a new distributor shows you a no objection certificate from us, you should not deal with this new distributor. Now this question is whether or not it is a competition law issue is $1 million question, because it is actually someone is trying to coerce a legitimate business of a pharma company not to deal with a new distributor. And CCI typically tells this as a tacit collusion between a primary pharmacy company and a distributor. In that analysis, CCI needs to also understand that in a given geographic market, if there are 150 to 300 pharmaceutical companies and each one is having about 50 distributors, a one-off distributor, if he is not able to enter the market, how would this become an effect in the market in terms of appreciable adverse effect? Can CCI address the issue of coercion, boycott? It can't. Then if it is not able to address the issue of coercion and diktat of the distributor companies, under law of agreement, it is not an agreement. How do you call it a tacit agreement? So in one of our appeal matters before the compact, Justice Singhvi had agreed to our analysis and completely set aside the order of the CCI that this tacit collusion, what CCI is claiming, is per se not an agreement since it is visited by coercion. So sometimes, we get very good order. For example, this liquid petroleum gas case in Supreme Court, at CCI and at appellate tribunal, this was held to be a bid rigging. But what Supreme Court has analyzed is something very nuanced view and very interesting. It said that IOCL, when it floats a tender, it actually asked all pan-India LPG suppliers to come and give a financial bid. It may be that all the bidders may have come to some kind of a collusive pricing. But when they submit the financial bid to IOCL in that matter, it was found that IOCL, in exercise of its countervailing power of a buyer, it directed all the LPG suppliers to supply at 11 rupees per cylinder less. And everyone had to agree, otherwise IOCL will blacklist that LPG manufacturer. The Honorable Supreme Court found that it cannot be a cartel because the agreement was alleged to have been entered into by the bidders ultimately got distinguished by the Supreme Court, by the IOCL, which was an agreement which IOCL dictated upon the suppliers. How can that fall within the ambit of competition law relatable to bid rigging? So it all depends how does a judge perceive or an adjudicator perceive a particular problem with regard to how a articulation of an argument made by a lawyer. So I fully agree with Madam Napinai that it is an evolutionary process, and even in US, Avirup, you know, 1890, the Sherman Act had come into being, and the United States is still innovating new and new facets of antitrust. And I just conclude by saying that there are questions asked whether the digital economy can be adjudicated by the CCI, whether an amendment of the Competition Act is required, a comprehensive amendment of Competition Act required. I don't agree, because Competition Act within its ambit has defined enterprise in such a manner that everything under the sun excepting the sovereign function of the state is all enterprise whichever is engaged in commercial activity. Am I going to say that the data companies are not making profits even if they're making zero pricing to their services? The answer is no. The moment they're making profit, you call for their balance sheets, you call for the ITO income tax return of the individuals, you will come to know where they are 2 years before and where they are now. If they are making economic advancement for themselves and in the process they are actually growing up, they may have a defense of innovation, but at the same time that is very much within the ambit and scope of the Competition Act. Even the decisional practice with the guidelines can lead in future rather than going for a comprehensive amendment. I stop here. I think I wanted to answer your question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Manas. If I could just add one more line before Ms. Napinai speaks. So one question, Ms. Napinai, I have is that in your I was trying to kind of figure out in your appearance before courts, do you find a Richard Posner in Indian courts? Will we ever find people of those type of scholars? I am asking this question not only because Manas is absolutely correct in terms of appreciation, but how do you write decisions appreciating foundational sort of theories of economics, which I think even Rahul was mentioning? Legal writing in India, judicial writing, do you think has developed, is developing? What do you think about that?
Avirup, your first question was difficult enough. Now you've added another layer to it and made it more difficult for me. I'm going to go into first principles here. The very construct of adversarial jurisprudence is certainty. So when you're talking about the evolution of legal precedents, the assumption is that there will be some level of certainty and some level of, following a precedent for a substantive period of time. Through the years, and I'm now, I've completed 30 years of practice in my 31st year. So though the last 2 years have kind of merged into each other. But, one thing I've noticed is this, we are always talking about a dilemma here. We're talking about competition laws, again, an evolving field. We're talking about the intersection of competition laws with technology, again, an evolving field. So we're talking about change and in the same breath, talking about certainty in life, right? When it comes to legal precedents, etc. So how do you balance both? First principles are what matters. We cannot shy away. We cannot assume. So this is what, whenever I do a training for judges, police, whoever, I always tell them, when you talk cyber laws, when you say technology law, when you say whatever prefix and law, please take away the prefix and just say law. Because ultimately, whatever the prefix may be, it is irrelevant in terms of your appreciation because you're still going to apply first principles. And that is my concern when it comes to evolving fields, that everybody somehow seems to think that this is dehorse first principles, that anything that's evolving is supposed to be something new, something different. It has no anchoring to what we have used to and what we rely upon in terms of a very traditional profession, right? Something that's one of the oldest possibly. So the two difficult questions that you asked, India has always had a welfare state perspective. And then we evolved into the liberated economy. So, I come from the generation which kind of like, balances both. I come from the generation which was in the license Raj and then moved into the liberation phase. Most of you millennials have seen only the liberation phase, and it may not be liberation enough for you. It may still seem very constricted. For us, any kind of freedom seems like a great thing to welcome, right? So when you look at it from this perspective or the lens of the pre and the post-liberation phase and where we are today, effectively, the judiciary is also struggling with that moving over from a welfare state concept to competition to now competition law, which is technically antitrust. So which kind of like tries to rein in competition. So imagine the kind of, variations that it has to take into account, even in terms of a mind space. And ultimately, you are absolutely right that individual perspectives may ultimately decide outcomes. But to obviate that, to ensure that this is not going to create what Saki mentioned earlier, and I don't even deign to speak for her, but from one perspective, if that was what she meant, I would totally agree with her on that, in the sense of that decisions should not be individual driven. Decisions should be legal framework driven. And therefore, it has to ensure certainty. And for that to happen, anybody who is in that position in whichever court, from Supreme Court down to the lowest court in the country, every single person has to decide based on the framework and not based on what their perspective is here. There, I totally agree that it should not be ad hoc. Merely because distinctions are there in different kinds of cases, I disagree in terms of it not being ad hoc. So I'll come down to this construct, therefore, of stare decisis. And why do we have this principle of stare decisis, which is that a precedent always takes priority, right? We have precedents as laws because that is what is supposed to create certainty. Every time a precedent is reviewed, every time it is overruled, that's why courts are very cautious to interfere. And we also have this construct of prospective overruling. Many occasions when even the Supreme Court failed to apply it and the nation suffered for it, including in cases like Bharat Aluminium, where there was a lot of economic repercussions. So actually in Bharat Aluminium, there was prospective overruling, if I'm not mistaken. But then it can have a repercussion if it is not done, as in Anwar versus Bashir. But in any event, the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, I agree with you that decisions cannot be individual based, but how can it become more broad based? And your second question on how can legal or judicial framing evolve? On a lighter vein, I can only recall this one comment by a Bombay High Court judge, as he then was, but he's now in the Apex Court. He said that he had visited the chambers of one of the US Supreme Court judges when they had these exchange programs. And he said, I saw the chambers and I then came back to mine. And I almost started feeling that I can fully understand how they write the kind of opinions they do. So from an infrastructure to support teams to how we do our own perception, because nobody stops learning, nobody stops reading. You may be the Chief Justice of India and you still never stop learning, right? You're continuously evolving, you're continuously reading and upskilling yourself. So that upskilling is what is going to and has in fact already to a substantial extent resulted in increasingly evolutionary judgments coming out from Indian courts, and I'm sure we can look forward to many more. We may have a situation of 1 step forward, 3 steps back, but again, that's bound to happen. That's no reason for us to get pessimistic. I think today I'm in my very optimistic mode, okay? So I'm like all for the assumption that we already have a very progressive move, even in terms of judicial writing and formation of opinions. Judicial opinions here. And I feel that there is a lot more coming our way, especially in the field of technology laws. And I would rather reframe it to say, I hope that we have a lot more coming our way. So thank you so much for those questions.
Thank you, Ms. Nappen. I am so happy that you are optimistic in the times that we live currently. Such optimism is much needed. So I hope we can take some of those optimism along from you. I'll just come to Sakhi. I know you've been waiting patiently for a long time. Sakhi, I have a question, which is, you belong to a think tank, which is our partner today for this program, who is one of the oldest think tanks in this area of firstly consumer protection law and then progressively antitrust law. Mr. Mehta has been writing since the early 90s about why Indian economy should open up and all of that. So my question to you, Sakhi, is that what do you think the role of research, role of think tanks like yours, like the several ones that's coming up in India currently? Even we in JHU have a dedicated competition law think tank. You might be aware, it's called Jericho, where we do dedicated research in areas of intellectual property and competition law. But I am not speaking from individual point of view as to what you are doing and what I am doing. What do you think of the role of research and the role of independent think tanks in this area of sort of improving or using economics in judicial decision making? The reason I ask this question, of course, is because as we see, the entire law and economics movement started in universities and then moved into courts. So what do you think about that?
So thank you very much for that question. And as you said, I was waiting very patiently. So I think before I move on to answering this question, I would like to make some thoughts out there. So I think going back to the very first intervention that I made. So I think Ms. Nappen, when I was talking about CCI taking an ad hoc approach, I think allow me to clarify for a moment, and Professor Bose also probably allow me a minute or two than my designated time. So I think when I'm talking about an ad hoc approach by the CCI, what I'm essentially trying to say is that I completely agree that the times that we are living in, the competition law, competition policy frameworks, the digital economy, new technologies, data protection, blockchain, so on and so forth. I think in the next 5-10 years, probably there'll be 10 more things that will be added to this list, hopefully, preferably, you never know. But I think this entire list of things, which is so evolutionary in nature, which is so dynamic in nature, which is why I think that basing your decisions solely on a legal precedent and solely on a set law framework which exists probably is not the best way to go for it. And by that, I don't mean that our existing competition frameworks are not adequate to deal with these markets or to deal with these problems. I completely confer with Mr. Chaudhary and also with you when we talk about and when we say that our frameworks, our existing frameworks, whatever we might have in place, are adequate, at least partially adequate for us to be able to, in the nascent stages that we are in, deal with these sorts of issues. But I think when I talk about the fact that CCI is taking an ad hoc approach, what I am essentially trying to say is that it's not apples and oranges, according to me. I think the fact that probably the competition regulator of the nation was unable to identify the fact that probably lack of evidence or lack of facts or whatever it might be, that in the WhatsApp and WhatsApp Pay case, that there was an inability of the regulator to see that this could have a potential adverse effect, which, to be very honest, I think was very immediately seen in the WhatsApp privacy policy case. So I think that linkages that become very, very necessary in these kinds of economies and in these kinds of technologies that we are dealing with, because of which I think it's not apples and oranges, because of which I think the intervention that I made earlier, that these companies, they have entered the digital economies from one aspect, but now the acquisitions or the agreements that they've had, the way that they're moving through the market, through the supply value chains, going into different markets, going into different streams, that doesn't make it apples and oranges anymore. It probably makes it apples, but maybe of different states and different regions, but it is still apples and only apples. Coming to my next point, I also think that because it is so dynamic, because it is moving from markets to markets, from maybe sectors to sectors, where probably something that we are not even realizing just now, I think we've read that all of these big tech companies are now going to enter the medical space. So we need to understand that moving from a search engine, a social media engine, to a medical space, we need to first regulate where they started with. We first need to regulate their roots. We first need to regulate that point of that inflection point. We need to identify that inflection point which gave them that power to, get into all of these subsequent markets, whether they are related or they are not related. Because of which I think that sticking to the black and white letter of law in such situations, in such circumstances, is not the most efficient way to go about it. It's probably not the most adequate way to go about it. And when I say this, I don't mean, I completely agree with Mr. Chaudhary that we don't necessarily need a comprehensive amendment to the competition law framework. We most definitely do not. However, what we do need is for the regulators to understand and to interpret the existing framework that we have in the best way possible. And that interpretation, I believe, has to stem not from a point of view or a perspective which looks at the existing scenario. What now we need is to have a vision. What now we need is to have a futuristic approach, a futuristic perspective, where we understand that giving this decision today is going to have this effect 10 years down the line, or maybe not even 10 years down the line, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line. And I think that is why we need to go beyond the black and white letter of the law and maybe look at the spirit. So I think when we're talking about the purpose and the aim of competition law, the Competition Act states that it is for to ensure free trade, it is to ensure consumer welfare, it is to ensure economic growth and development. All of these things are as dynamic, all of these purposes and aims in their spirit are as dynamic as these digital economies or as these new technologies are. In that sense, I think also this also brings me to my next point, that when we were Mr. Chaudhary and I think Mr. Sharma also talked about perceptions and how consumers view these markets, because of which then that sort of impacts how the economic analysis is done or how these decisions are made. I would disagree over there in saying that is what should be done, but I don't necessarily believe that is what is actually happening. Because I think when we talk about these digital markets, probably, and of course there is a very obvious lack from the point, I think, of information asymmetry, where we believe that the consumers and the end users themselves probably don't understand what and how these technologies function. But at the same time, the conduct of these businesses is no longer based on the perceptions of consumers. Rather, the conduct of these businesses is now manipulating the perceptions of these consumers. And I think that distinction is very, very important, because I think the moment we don't draw that distinction is where we fail to realize that there is a huge difference between the traditional economy and the digital economy. Of course, I again agree that our traditional economic principles, our traditional competition law principles are adequate. I agree that first principles are important. But again, the interpretation and the way we implement these first principles, the way we look at our traditional frameworks, they need to change. It needs to become more visionary. It needs to become more futuristic in our implementation, in the way that we do things. Again, I think Ms. Napana,
Saki, if you could just also turn to my question, because I think then...
Yes, of course.
I mean, you can use it in your closing remarks also.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I was just getting to that. So I think there was, this, when we talk about tacit collusion, when we talk about certainty, when we talk about following precedents, I think that is exactly where going, not against that, but I think what needs to be complemented, alongside using laws, the existing legal frameworks, the existing precedents that we have, is research. And I don't think I can emphasize the importance of research anymore. And to be very honest, I'm at a very, very modest stage of my career. I've just started working. I have, just entered into the entire think tank research institution space. But I think in this very, very less time, it hasn't taken me a very long time, even in this short duration, to understand the importance of research, to understand what is the importance of these independent, individualistic think tanks. And the reason I say that is because the moment I am sitting and reading, and the moment I am trying to understand how these markets function, I am also trying to understand from a very systemic approach, from a very systemic point of view, that we need to go beyond what we already have. What we already have is not bad, but we need more. And that more has to be research. Just giving a very brief example, I think, and this is something I think that even a lot of competition agencies have not fully understood the grasp of. And that was very, very evident at, I think, pretty much around the same time last year, when we were seeing all of these competition agencies allowing collaborations between different firms and different companies to combat COVID-19, to allow to fill the gaps of the supply and demand deficits and all of that, especially with related to essential items and medical supplies and PPE kits and so on and so forth. But I think even then, so I think that was when we at CUTS International, we wrote this paper and we sort of conducted this survey with competition agencies worldwide to understand what kind of collaborative agreements, these competition authorities are allowing competitors to get into. And the lowest, or rather zero leeways were given with respect to R&D. And I think that is very, very, that's sad, right? Because I mean, given the COVID times, and I think the COVID times are probably, it's a similar framework, it's a similar approach that we need to have when we deal with these digital economies, because the COVID pandemic has been as new and as novice for us as the digital economies and these new technologies are. And we are seeing that it has been a lack of research, or probably a lot of research, which has helped us during these COVID times to understand what works and what doesn't work. Of course, research is not the only thing. Research has to be complemented by implementation, which is where I think think tanks come into play, who also, undertake these independent surveys, they undertake studies, they actually go on ground and see and talk to people that, if this is a policy, how does it affect you? Or if this is not a policy, would you want it to be there? So on and so forth. And so I think research, as important as it is, I think the role of think tanks is much, much greater, because think tanks are not restricted to research. There's advocacy, there's dissemination. You go and you talk to consumers. You go and you spread awareness. You talk about the importance of not only governments and businesses doing their bits, but also consumers knowing that this is what should be happening for them and this is what they should be doing. So I think I will just conclude by saying that I do belong to the millennial age, and I will definitely agree with you, Ms. Napanai, that for us, at least for me, the liberation that we have as of now is not enough. But the only reason for that is because I truly, genuinely believe that the entire space around me is liberating at a faster pace than we can even fathom, that I can even begin to fathom. And so I think the moment we get, we get satisfied with the level of liberation that we have or that we are trying to achieve, it might be a disservice to the environment around us, to the economies around us. And I think that is where I will end my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakhi. Very briefly, Rahul, we have almost, I have one question for the entire panel, but I'll just give you a very it's not technically within our panel's mandate, but you are a cyber security specialist. So I want to just throw in a question there, because we've been talking about cyber law, we've been talking about data, of course, the panel looks at economic decision making, but what is equally important is protection on cyber security from that point of view. So if you could quickly add, as we evolve, as the regulation in these areas evolve, are people forgetting about cyber security because you've worked at the policy stage, you've worked with think tanks and sort of research bodies like. So very quickly, Rahul, I can give you just 2 minutes because we have a list of questions, and I have one final question for all the panelists.
All right, thank you. So I'll divide 2 minutes into 4 parts of 30 seconds each, and answer all the different aspects I wanted to cover. So first is as Napanai mentioned earlier about the changing language and the vocabulary of this new space, and how does it translate into judicial understanding, and how when the laws and policies are framed, they may have some spirit, but in terms of how it is understood, or how the lawyers make judges or clients understand, it may have a different interpretation or meaning. So in that case, those language, those principles, I agree that we have the foundational principles that can be applied. But if you look at, given this space is so rapidly evolving, I'll just take an example of, the liability of an administrator of a chat messenger group. We have had numerous court judgments which say admin is responsible, not responsible, is responsible, not responsible. So, we keep on fluctuating on those things. Because it's a new thing, because we do not understand it very closely enough. So we have conflicting views, even if, we are trying to apply the same principles in some cases. So that nuanced approach is very important. And now I'll just jump to the second part. I think which you initially asked, but I did not cover, on the aspect of data and the privacy, how the privacy and competition interface. By default, privacy is a fundamental right, and the economic principles, the competition principles should not trump the basic principles or the basic human rights of the individuals. But how do we make competition act in a way and apply those principles that there is an increasing competition, and if there is an increasing competition, there are lesser monopolies and lesser chances of increasing concentration of powers and abuse of personal data. So that from that viewpoint, I think on how these things interface are very important, and so is the interface between the regulatory authorities. We have specialist regulatory authorities. The DPA will come up when the data protection law is there. The Competition Commission will have its own say. So they will have interfaces, and that interdisciplinary learning, I think that's the way to go forward. And I hope that there is more that we can continue. And now to the last point on the cybersecurity, I think cybersecurity is the underlying thing. So I don't think that people have two different ways on cybersecurity, unlike privacy, we have different views, nuances, cultural views, understanding on how things are. Cybersecurity is the need to protect data and how it can be protected using tools, techniques, procedures, and different techniques that can be applied. So from that viewpoint, I think the stakeholders, it's very important. I won't say that we have got the due attention it deserves, but the circumstances itself are leading us wherein we have no choice but to give them careful consideration, be it be increasing hacking or espionage or all those things are making us more aware and inherently insecure that we have to have this baked into consideration when we design policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. So I have this last question because we have like 3 or 4 good questions that have come from the audience. So like my last question, and anybody can comment on this. This is something that has bothered me for a very long point of time. And I wanted to know your opinion about it. Do you think that the people who become the bureaucrats or the lawyers who become a part of these regulators, or the people who become judges in our courts, which primarily recruits from the practicing bench, do you think that allows appreciation of economics in the judicial decision making? What I'm trying to suggest here is that unlike a United States, you will not find a practicing advocate or a practicing lawyer or a professor of economics who will become a part of the Indian Commission. It hasn't happened yet. It may happen in the future. You will not find a professor becoming a judge at a federal or a high court or a Supreme Court. Although there are provisions of appointing jurists to the Supreme Court, that has never happened. Do you think that kind of also hinders this movement towards appreciation of research? Again, I am not suggesting here that the Supreme Court is blind to research. The decisions of privacy and nowadays, and all of those routinely quotes from researchers and articles, and that is a recent trend of the Supreme Court. But I think there could have been much more. Do you think that the recruitment through which our judges come onto the courts, or our commissioners or our members of the CCI become members, do you think there is a problem there in terms of appreciation of economics? It's an open question. Anybody can pick it up.
If I go first, the basic challenge, if I'm now talking about, I was from the judicial service of the state. I know how difficult it was to really stay on the judicial service, because there was a quota in the High Court. Practicing advocates would be automatically elevated to the bench. So a judicial officer, however he may have started his career at the age of 21, 22, would be languishing during our times. So I had decided to quit. So that is one answer to your question straight away. And I'm not bragging. I was topper in my batch. I was doing very well. During my lifetime in one station, I could get a High Court order confirmed, yet I left. So that is first answer to your question. Second, coming back to the CCI, it's an institutional memory loss. The moment a retired bureaucrat or a person is given the mandate to work on a competition law, he is already around 60, 61. He may not have even known what a competition law is during his entire academic career and bureaucratic career. Even as a professor of law, you know that competition law is still an optional subject or a credit course in prestigious National Law School in India. When I was in CCI, we tried through our advocacy process to impress upon AICTE and UGC to introduce competition law in the law curriculum. Till date, it is an optional subject. Even Bar Council of India put down their hand saying, no, MRTP should continue. So I think I have answered your question. It's an institutional memory loss. It's a problem.
Thank you, Manas. Anybody else who wants to have share their views? I completely agree with, I would want to see people like Professor Bhattacharya of the Delhi School of Economics, or, some of the leading partners of Indian law firms, not only on CCI, on other relevant regulators. I think the bureaucratization of regulatory bodies, I do find has been a challenge, and as we are evolving and as the regulations are touching new areas of law, which is itself in its nascent stage, I completely agree with you, Manas.
But one point, Aviru, I wanted to share with all of the panelists and this audience. Right from the time the Competition Act with only a 64 or 66 sections legislation, it has been amended many a times. Besides, CCI has been coming up with the statutory regulations almost every year. We have always been in the part of the competition law amendment group. And I, for one, being a lawyer, always advocated under Section 35 of the Competition Act to introduce economists who should be appearing before CCI with the economist report, and it has always been turned down. That is not the case in European Union, neither it is in the US. So if we are mimicking the legislation from the West, why are we not taking economists as part of it? And since economists are not statutory part of the Competition Act, the economist report invariably forms an annexure to the paper book, and that never gets the light of the day, either with the CCI or with the appellate tribunal, or for that matter, anybody else. This is a very, very sad state of affairs.
So, on a lighter note, I would also like to add that, there is also this lawyerization of, I am sorry that I'm speaking this panel, but this lawyerization of the policy-making process and the regulatory bodies, it's looked at primarily from the lens of law, legal principles, applicability. I think that also needs to change. We need to have more multidisciplinary people, not just economists, but from different walks of life, different experience levels. It needs to be more diverse to have a more comprehensive outlook and framework. Else, if it will become a cycle. If it gets dominated, then it becomes monopoly, and that is what Competition Commission is sort of trying to stop.
One thing, Rahul, I would just, sorry to interrupt. End of the day, every judicial authority is the final authority wherever you go. It is European Court of Justice in the EU. It is the Federal Supreme Court of the US. It is the Supreme Court of UK. It is the Supreme Court of India. The judges would always believe upon the principles of law. And how do you lead evidence? If you are able to lead evidence on economic principles well, why should a judge disagree? Unfortunately, the part is that the economics are not able to relate the things into a robust evidence. And the judges would not be able to just go on to theories, graphs, charts. They will not be interested in doing that. They would like to understand how the harm has been caused and how is the remedy being suggested by way of an evidence. If that is not there, the judges cannot be asked to be imaginary poets. It's not possible.
Well, from my perspective, I'm all for diversity. In fact, when the second round of the NJAC case was going on, Justice Kurian Joseph, who was then a sitting judge, spoke about this issue, that there is a scope for jurists being appointed as judges, and he questioned why this was not being adopted. You have judges who are moving from lower judiciary to higher judiciary. You have lawyers being moved from the bar to the bench, but why is it that jurists are not being done? This question itself is now nearly 5+ years old, but it's not yet been addressed today. But then when we talk about diversity and the bench, we are also in the midst of a lot of controversies in terms of what are the other aspects in which diversity is not there, including gender. So there is a long way to go when we talk about diversity on the bench and why it's needed. But just to bring another lens to it, be it policy making, be it judicial decision making, it's not like experts are not involved. To say that they are not involved would be very myopic or would be very simplistic. So we have a process even in judicial decision making, which ensures that you will be involving experts in it. It's unheard of that in the apex court, a non-lawyer will be called upon to represent. In a way, that's what happened in the Aadhaar case. The CEO of UIDAI was allowed to represent before the court because the court wanted to hear experts from other fields also, right? So the apex court has set the pace to show that where necessary, the courts need to involve experts. Amicus curiae is appointed because where in a matter court believes that an expert opinion or an expert intervention is needed, they will be involved. I'm appearing as amicus curiae too in one of the matters before the Supreme Court. So it's not like we do not have a process which involves experts. It's the mode and manner of involvement. In fact, if I were to take a contrary view to what Rahul said, I would say the Information Technology Act suffers because it went more with the technology experts than with the legal, which is why it fell very weak on legal constructs. So therefore we need to balance everything out. And this is where I will link it to Saki's intervention to say that it cannot be looked at with such unidimensional lenses. You'll have to apply a multidimensional lens whenever you're looking at any form of decision making or anything that is going to impact a larger public good aspect. We are today talking about public good and data protection laws. And we are already evaluating how far it's going to impact both in terms of an economical perspective and also the welfare state perspective. So when I spoke about the my generation versus the millennial generation, and by the way, I believe that I'm a millennial too, because I may belong to the 60s. There, I gave away my age, right? I may belong to the 60s generation, but I was the first adapter to technology laws when people did not even know the word technology or cyber. So therefore, in that sense, a millennial is not in an age, it's in the mind, and how you think and how you are willing to adapt, willing to evolve, and willing to evaluate and assess the situation as it evolves and not be stuck, in the mud, not be stuck in concrete. Law is also like that. When we talk about dynamism versus certainty, and this is where I truly believe that the legalization of policy making is important, but what we need is actually practitioners coming into policy making, not just looking at it in a very simplistic way because of this delineation which gets lost in policy making, which is that certainty does not mean getting stuck in concrete. Certainty means ensuring elasticity and dynamism in law in such a way that it evolves to embrace technologies, situations, requirements as it is today, but is dynamic enough to adapt to evolving technologies and situations 20, 40, 100 years down the line. If we have laws which have adapted and are still robust, still capable of being applied, considering 100 years of phenomenal and exponential change has happened in our lives and technologies and everything that's happened around us, that is what dynamism is all about. And this is my takeaway for anybody involved in policy making. Do not make something which is too myopic or too immediate. Dynamism has to go hand in hand with certainty in such a way that you retain first principles. For instance, I will just explain it in more specifics. You can't have open-ended provisions for criminal laws. That is contrary to criminal jurisprudence. It has to be precise. Whereas you can have purposive interpretation and therefore open-ended provisions for civil, in terms of applicability, but not on liability. So this is where the nuancing happens, and you must be able to apply your mind, keep it open to open out legislative processes to take into account the economic requirement with the welfare state requirement and balance both. But to say that judicial decisions should take into account these things is giving the right of legislative processes to the judiciary, which the judiciary does not have. Judiciary has to work within the parameters of law laid down. And I stand by what I said earlier and do reiterate that I am taking a contrary view from Saki's in that, because it's not just about not being able to do something. It is inappropriate when somebody says judiciary is supposed to take a decision based on economics rather than the law as it has been laid down or legal frameworks. It's inappropriate and it's impermissible. That's the way rule of law works, and we can't go beyond the rule of law here.
Thank you, Ms. Napinai. I don't think anybody else wants to say something. We've reached almost towards the end. I have 5 more minutes left. And I have a few questions which I want to I'm using my moderator's discretion of not kind of referring to all the questions because there are a couple of them. I think I will read out the question, and anybody who wants to pick it up might want to do that. Recently, a retired Chief Justice of India contended the need for artificial intelligence in justice delivery, whereas on the other hand, the institution is suffering from its own structural and functional problems. Do you think need for artificial intelligence is a kind of ill-placed priority for the institution? Anybody who wants to take this question, do you think artificial intelligence, or for that matter, the way Justice Chandrachud recently presided over a more open and a more delivery of the judicial system, in the times of COVID or even without it, given that amount of deadlock that we have notoriously, do you think artificial intelligence or technology should be welcomed into judicial decision making? Yes, Ms. Napana, you can begin, and anybody else can chip in.
So, one of the earliest times when I had proposed technology in law was in 2004, and at that point of time, it was considered a little ahead of time. So you take not just artificial intelligence, you go beyond just e-courts and virtual hearings, as we have actually survived over the last couple of years, a year and a half now through COVID, to ensure that justice delivery doesn't come completely to a standstill. Adaptation of technology is a sine qua non for judicial justice delivery today. Be it AI, be it blockchain, be it any of the emerging technologies. I personally believe blockchain is one of the most adaptable technologies for ensuring, effective evidence delivery for judicial decision making. On the aspect of use of AI, I just wanted to clarify one thing. We are just catching up, and I'm so glad that the Supreme Court has limited the use of AI to just a supportive tool, not as a supplemental tool. What I'm trying to emphasize is that the US adapted this technology corpus to assist it, for instance, in sentencing. Okay, and the ProPublica published a report which showed clear bias in this process of recommendation of sentencing, where it was a clear racial discrimination, etc. So when we are adapting technology, we have to be careful in terms of what is it that we are adapting it for. Today, when you're deciding a liability claim in terms of autonomous vehicles, the underlying issue that every court, be it US, Europe, or wherever it may be, says is humans cannot be replaced by technology. The human behind the wheel still has to take liability. Similarly, when you're adapting technology to judicial decision making, it cannot supplement judicial decision making. It can be a supportive tool, for instance, where here it is supposed to help in terms of research, in terms of, if you were to use blockchain to show accountability, transparency, and immutability in terms of filing to the passing of orders, you can actually root out corruption from judiciary. So there is a way in which technology can be adapted, and it should be adapted. We cannot sequentialize adaptation of technology to say we have much more important problems. We always have much more important problems. Even today, from 80 years back or 70 plus years to make it more precise, to now we still talk roti, kapda, makan. But that doesn't mean we also won't talk about emerging technologies and the relevance of it to public, right? So we need to balance both out. And on the e-court aspect, one of the most amazing things that the Supreme Court took up was the e-court project, which was originally under Justice Madan Lokur and now with Justice Chandrachud. It has been doing a phenomenal job of connecting all the courts, correlating decisions. That also helps in, again, what we've been talking about. I am at least very consistent in my opinions and saying about certainty also. So this kind of e-court project also again helps in terms of certainty in terms of decision making, irrespective of which code. I mean, this is a utopian mean, which is something which can be possible through adaptation of technology. So I would definitely say we cannot eschew technology, we need it, but we have to be careful in terms of where we adapt it and not allow it to supplement the human element.
Just a brief point here. So I think completely agree that that use of technology has to be embraced, and I wish that we would have hoped that courts would at least live stream all their not non-sensitive cases at least, so that people can view how things are. For people like us, it's completely a black box on how things are unless we have to go to a court. There's an opportunity, we have to use technology, and the ultimate aim, as ma'am initially said, that we have to remove the individuality in terms of decision making, so that we institutionalize this, and with the use of technology happening more and more, I think there will be more and more standards and uniformity across different cases. So that, and also important that the biases, as ma'am was mentioning, that we should be very careful that our biases are not reinforced through various aspects of the algorithmic decision making or the artificial intelligence, as we say, in the criminal justice system. So because that gets built on over and over, and that becomes like that gives a lot of problems. So yeah, use of technology for good, I think there is no two ways that this has to happen and must be embraced. I'll stop my intervention. Thank you.
I think we've reached the very end of our discussion, and there were interesting questions lined up, but I've been told that the next panel must start in time. Thank you everybody for having such a wonderful and diverse opinion on this panel. We disagreed, we differed, and that's what as lawyers we're supposed to do. I conclude by reminding us, I know Rahul, you're not a lawyer, but the rest of us are, so, and it's a panel on economics. So as Justice Brandeis had said many years ago, that a lawyer who hasn't learned economics is apt to be a public enemy. I think not only there is lawyerization, as you said, but as lawyers, we should also open up to more schools. And as Ms. Napinai was suggesting, continuously learn and apply those learnings to the arguments that we bring either in our research or before courts in terms of advancing the cause of our client or the cause of the work that we do. Thank you everyone for a wonderful panel. I only hope that you and your loved ones remain safe in the situations that we are currently struggling with. Thank you again. Yes, Srijit, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, moderator. And thanks to everyone connected to us through JGU's YouTube channel. It was an insightful and vibrant session, but we have come to the end of it. Our fourth technical session, an economic analysis of industrial innovation and intellectual property, will commence at 3:55 p.m. Please stay connected or tune in at 3:55 p.m. Thank you, everyone.